Grant Kelleher slid the invoice across his desk without reading it. 12 weeks of labor, every part catalogued, every torque value logged to the decimal, and the CFO of Street Marin Regional Medical Center pushed it back like junk mail. The work was never formally authorized, he said. Sawyer Briggs stood there with grease still lining his knuckles and said nothing. He looked through the window to where the Eurocopter EC-135 he had rebuilt from the gearbox out sat gleaming on the helipad. He knew no pilot alive would fly it without his signature on the release. 3 months earlier, Sawyer and his daughter Ruby lived in a single-wide trailer at the edge of Granger Falls, Montana. The town sat in a valley between two mountain ranges. 18,000 people spread across ranches and old mining roads, and the trailer park on Ridgeline Drive was the cheapest address in any direction. Sawyer had sold the house in Fort Campbell, Kentucky, 6 months before that. The house where his wife had arranged the bookshelves by color. The house where she had died on the living room couch while Ruby was at school, the cancer finishing what 18 months of chemotherapy could not. He packed the photographs into a cardboard box and left the furniture for the estate sale. Ruby sat at the fold-down kitchen table most afternoons, drawing helicopters with colored pencils. She had been drawing them since she was 4. She had grown up on a military post where they flew overhead before breakfast. "Daddy, when are we getting a real house?" she asked one Tuesday without looking up from her sketch. Sawyer poured her a glass of milk and said, "When the right one shows up, sweetheart." He found work around town the way quiet men with skilled hands always do. A rancher's diesel engine that had been sitting dead for 2 months, Sawyer had it running in 4 hours. A transmission rebuild for the hardware store owner. A hydraulic pump replacement on a hay baler that 3 other mechanics had given up on. People knew him as the mechanic from the trailer park. Polite, kept to himself. Never talked about where he came from. Never overcharged. Linnea Garrick showed up at the garage on a Friday afternoon in late September. She drove a white hospital SUV with the Street Marin Regional Medical Center logo on the door, and she wore her ID badge clipped to the lapel of her jacket. She was 37 years old, unmarried, and direct in a way that came from years of managing pilots and paramedics who did not respond well to ambiguity. She asked the garage owner if anyone local had experience with turboshaft engines. The owner pointed at Sawyer, who was elbow-deep in a John Deere combine harvester. Linnea walked over and explained. Street Marin operated a single EMS helicopter program, one EC-135, serving 4 counties across some of the most remote terrain in the northern Rockies. The aircraft had suffered a hard landing 3 weeks ago, damage to the main gearbox, the tail rotor assembly, and several structural mounts. The primary maintenance contractor out of Billings had inspected it, quoted $280,000, and recommended the hospital purchase a new aircraft. The flight program had been grounded since. Sawyer wiped his hands on a rag and asked 3 questions. What was the condition of the main gearbox input seal? Whether the tail rotor driveshaft had shown any lateral displacement during the post-incident inspection, and if anyone had checked the engine deck mounts for hairline stress fractures along the forward attach points. Linnea stared at him. These were not the questions a general mechanic would think to ask. "I have worked on helicopters before," Sawyer said, his voice even. "I can take a look if you want." She drove him to the hospital hangar that afternoon. Sawyer circled the EC-135 slowly, opened panels, ran his fingers along the airframe seams the way a surgeon checks suture lines. He crouched beneath the fuselage and studied the belly with a flashlight for a long time. When he stood up, he told Linnea he could rebuild it 10 to 12 weeks, and he would need to source specific components: a new main rotor gearbox, replacement tail rotor blades, several actuator assemblies. Linnea said she would handle the administrative side and get the paperwork moving. They shook hands. The agreement was professional, efficient, and entirely verbal. But she noticed something she could not yet define. The way Sawyer touched the aircraft was not curiosity. It was recognition. The way a man touches something he has been away from for too long. Sawyer started work in the hangar the following Monday morning. He arrived at 7, laid his tools out in a precise grid on a rolling cart, and began the disassembly with the methodical calm of a man following a checklist that existed only in his muscle memory. Ruby came after school each day, dropped her backpack in the corner near a space heater, and sat on a folding chair with her colored pencils and a sketch pad. The hangar became their second home. Some nights Sawyer worked until 8, and Ruby would fall asleep on the folding chair with her jacket as a blanket, and he would carry her to the truck without waking her. Conrad Voss noticed first. Connie was 59, the lead pilot of the EMS program, a former Army aviator who had flown Hueys in the late 80s and Black Hawks through the 90s before transitioning to civilian work. He leaned against the hangar doorframe most afternoons, watching Sawyer without saying much. What he saw puzzled him. The work was too precise. The way Sawyer indexed gearbox components before removal, using a numbering system that matched no civilian manual Connie had ever seen. The way he torqued fasteners in the exact star pattern from military technical orders. The way he handled the tail rotor assembly with the unconscious efficiency of a man who had done it hundreds of times. On the third week, Sawyer rolled up his sleeves to reach a coupling buried deep inside the transmission housing. Connie, standing 6 feet away, saw the tattoo on the inside of his left wrist, small, faded to blue-gray, easy to miss if you did not know what you were looking at. A winged Pegasus above a sword and a crescent moon. The insignia of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, the most elite rotary wing aviation unit in the United States military. Connie set his coffee down. He waited until Ruby left for the restroom, then walked over and stood close enough that only Sawyer could hear him. "When did you get out?" he asked. Sawyer's hands stopped moving. The two men looked at each other for 3 seconds, and in that hangar, 3 seconds was enough. 3 years ago, Sawyer said quietly. CW4, 14 years in. Maintenance test pilot. I was responsible for the Black Hawk and Chinook fleet across multiple deployments. I would appreciate it if that stayed between us. Connie nodded slowly, but something shifted behind his eyes. The recognition that the helicopter in pieces on this floor was being rebuilt by one of the most qualified aviation maintenance technicians the United States had ever produced. From that day forward, he stopped watching Sawyer with curiosity and started watching with something closer to reverence. That same week, Sawyer discovered a problem nobody had flagged. Deep inside the main drivetrain, a bearing race showed micro-pitting tiny surface craters invisible to the naked eye but unmistakable under a bore scope. The pitting would pass a ground-run vibration check, but at 120 knots, it would produce a harmonic shimmy that a pilot might ignore once, dismiss twice, and feel tear something loose on the third flight. Sawyer added the repair to his work scope without adding it to the invoice, because rebuilding a helicopter halfway was the same as not rebuilding it at all. Linnea began visiting the hangar more frequently. At first, it was progress checks, clipboard in hand, questions about the timeline. Then, the clipboard disappeared. She started bringing coffee in a thermos, pouring it into 2 mismatched mugs from the break room. She asked about Ruby's school, about the trailer park. Sawyer answered in short sentences that were not unfriendly, just careful. One afternoon, Ruby ran across the hangar floor clutching a new drawing, the EC-135 in flight, rendered in blue and white with a yellow sun behind it, and presented it to Linnea with the radiant confidence of an 8-year-old. Linnea crouched down and told her it was the best helicopter she had ever seen. Sawyer watched them from 20 feet away. His wrench paused mid-turn, and for a long moment he forgot what he had been tightening. Linnea submitted the budget authorization request for Sawyer's contract to Grant Kelleher on a Wednesday morning. She had documented everything's scope of work, estimated costs, the timeline, Sawyer's qualifications as she understood them, and the fact that his quote was a fraction of what the Billings contractor had assessed. She emailed the package, printed a hard copy, and hand-delivered it to Grant's corner office on the administrative floor. Grant had known about Sawyer's work from the beginning. He had seen the emails. He had heard Linnea's progress reports in the weekly staff meetings. He had nodded along and said things like, "Keep me posted," without ever putting a signature on a purchase order. The omission was deliberate. Grant Kelleher had spent the past 18 months quietly lobbying the hospital's board of directors to discontinue the EMS helicopter program entirely. It was expensive fuel, liability insurance, pilot salaries, maintenance contracts, hangar fees. Grant had been building a financial case to replace helicopter transport with long-range ground ambulance contracts through a company called MedTransit West, a company in which Grant held an undisclosed equity stake. A functioning, affordable helicopter undermined that case. A permanently grounded one supported it. "There is no authorized purchase order," Grant told Linnea, his voice flat and practiced. "Any verbal agreement you made with this individual carries no legal weight." Linnea pushed back. She had email threads messages from the medical director, from the chief nursing officer, all acknowledging the repair project, all expressing urgency about returning the aircraft to service. "Emails are not contracts," Grant said. He closed the folder and placed his hands flat on the desk, a gesture that meant the conversation was over. Linnea drove to the hangar that afternoon. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching Sawyer route a new hydraulic line along the belly of the airframe with the steady, unhurried hands of a man who trusted his own precision more than most people trusted anything. She told him there was a problem with the payment authorization on the administrative side, but that she was working through it. Sawyer looked at her, nodded once, and picked up a torque wrench. He did not ask about the money. He did not ask how long it would take. He went back to work, but after Linnea's vehicle pulled out of the lot, his hands paused on the wrench, and he stood motionless for a long moment, staring at the airframe without seeing it. That night, after Ruby fell asleep in the narrow bed at the back of the trailer, Sawyer sat on the metal steps outside. The air was cold enough to see his breath. He opened his banking app and looked at the balance enough for groceries, lot rent, Ruby's school lunch account, and gas for another 5 or 6 weeks. After that, the math stopped working. He closed the phone, leaned back against the trailer door, and looked up. The Montana sky was enormous and cold and crowded with stars, and it offered him nothing except the ancient, indifferent reminder that the universe did not keep ledgers. He had bet everything he had on a handshake with a woman he barely knew, and the house was already playing against him. His phone buzzed at 10:45. Linnea, her voice was tired, stripped of the professional composure she wore during the day, and underneath it he could hear something raw and personal that she probably had not intended to let through. "I am not going to let them do this to you," she said. Sawyer was quiet for a long time. The silence stretched across the phone line like a held breath. Then he said, "I know you won't." 3 words, but they carried something that surprised both of them, the weight of a trust that had been forming without permission, assembling itself quietly in the space between coffee mugs and helicopter parts and afternoons, spent in a hangar where an 8-year-old girl drew pictures of flight. Linnea closed her eyes and held the phone against her ear and let the silence stay. Sawyer drove the last bolt home on a Thursday morning in January, 14 weeks after he had started. He ran the ground tests methodically: engine start sequence, rotor engagement, full systems check, vibration analysis at multiple RPM bands. Every parameter came back within specification. Several came back tighter than factory numbers. Connie stood on the tarmac with his arms crossed and watched the rotors turn for the first time in 4 months, the sound building from a low whine to the deep, rhythmic thrum that anyone who has lived around helicopters can feel in their sternum. "That is not a rebuild," Connie said. "That is a resurrection." Sawyer spent the next 2 days completing the maintenance records. Every step documented, every replacement part cataloged with manufacturer serial numbers, lot codes, and installation dates. Every torque value logged to the decimal in both foot-pounds and newton-meters. The documentation followed FAA Part 135 airworthiness standards with a thoroughness that no civilian contractor in Montana would have matched, because Sawyer had spent 14 years maintaining aircraft under military technical order systems that made FAA paperwork look like a suggestion box. The records were comprehensive enough that any qualified inspector in the country could trace exactly what had been done, in what order, with what parts, by whose hands. And at the back of the maintenance file, on the final page, there was a single blank line: the return to service release, requiring the signature of the mechanic who had performed the work. Sawyer submitted his invoice to hospital administration. $47,000. Labor. Specialized parts he had purchased from his own savings. Professional consultation fees. The total was roughly 1/6 of what the Billings contractor had quoted to do the same work, or, more accurately, to not do it, and recommend buying a new aircraft instead. Grant Kelleher met Sawyer in his office. This was the scene from the beginning: the same desk, the same invoice, the same man behind the desk with his hands folded, but now the audience understood the full weight of what stood behind it. Grant slid the invoice back without reading it. No authorized purchase order, no signed contract, No legal obligation. He straightened his tie and said, "You should have known better than to work without a formal agreement." Sawyer looked at him. He did not raise his voice. He did not lean forward. "The helicopter is ready," he said. "Whether you pay me or not does not change what I put into it." He turned and walked out of the office. Linnea was in the hallway. She had heard enough through the open door to understand what had just happened, and the anger on her face was the quiet, structural kind, not a flash but a load bearing down. She caught up to Sawyer near the elevator. "I am taking this to the board," she said, her voice tight. "This is theft, Sawyer." He stopped walking. He turned and looked at her, and there was something in his expression she had not seen before, not defeat, but a deep and practiced familiarity with being failed by institutions that were supposed to be better. "Do not fight this one for me," he said quietly. "Fight it for the next person they do this to." He stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. Linnea stood in the empty corridor with her hands trembling at her sides, and she understood with a clarity that hurt that this man had been discarded before and that he had survived it by caring about the work more than the reward. It opened something in her chest that she had kept locked for a long time. Sawyer went back to work, not at the hangar, at the garage, under trucks and tractors and irrigation pumps, where the jobs were small and the checks cleared. He did not hire a lawyer. He did not call the local newspaper. He did not post about it online. He drove home each evening, made dinner for Ruby, sat beside her while she did her math homework, and read on the trailer steps after she fell asleep. Ruby asked him once if he was sad about the helicopter. Sawyer looked at her and said, "I am not sad, sweetheart. I just want to make sure it is safe." The problem surfaced within days, exactly as Sawyer had known it would. The EC-135 sat on the helipad, mechanically perfect, gleaming in the thin Montana winter light, ready to fly in every way except one. Sawyer had not signed the return-to-service release. Under FAA regulations, the mechanic who performed major maintenance on an aircraft was the only person authorized to certify the work and release it for flight. Without that signature, the helicopter was grounded. Not by policy, not by opinion. By federal law. Grant instructed the hospital's technical team to find a workaround. There was none. Federal aviation law did not carve out exceptions for billing disputes or administrative oversights. The only alternative was to hire a new certified maintenance technician to re-inspect the entire aircraft from the first bolt to the last, a process that would take 8 to 10 weeks at a minimum and would likely cost more than Sawyer's $47,000 invoice. Grant did not authorize that either. 11 days after Sawyer walked out of the hospital, the dispatch radio in the EMS coordination room crackled with an emergency call. Multi-vehicle accident on the Pass Road, 47 miles east of Granger Falls. One patient critical. Suspected spinal cord injury. Helicopter transport requested. Linnea stood in the coordination room next to her flight dispatcher and watched the man's face as he confirmed what everyone already knew. The EC-135 was not cleared for flight. A ground ambulance was dispatched instead. 3 hours on narrow mountain roads. The patient survived, but barely stabilized at Street. Marin, with injuries that would have responded better to the 22-minute flight that should have been available. Linnea found Sawyer at the garage that evening. She did not come to ask him to sign the release. She sat down on an overturned 5-gallon bucket next to his workbench and said, "I want you to know what happened today." She told him about the accident, the patient, the 3-hour drive that should have been a flight. Sawyer listened without moving, his jaw tightening incrementally with each detail, his eyes fixed on the stained concrete floor. When she finished, the garage was quiet, except for the tick of a cooling engine block and the distant sound of a truck on the highway. "I knew he would not pay me," Sawyer said, "but I did not think he would let someone die over his pride." It was not a refusal to sign, and Linnea knew it. It was something more layered, the position of a man who understood that a return-to-service signature carried personal legal liability and who could not attach that liability to an organization that had formally denied he was the person responsible for the work. If the hospital did not recognize him as the mechanic of record, then he was not the mechanic of record. And a mechanic who did not exist on paper could not sign a document that required him to exist on paper. The logic was airtight, and the principle underneath it was immovable. Linnea sat with that silence. She did not argue. She understood. After a long time, She put her hand on the workbench near his, not touching but close enough that they could both feel the warmth. Then she stood up, said goodnight, and drove back to the hospital alone. Grant made one more move. He contracted an outside aviation maintenance firm from Denver to fly in, re-inspect the EC-135, and issue their own return-to-service sign-off. The Denver crew, 2 A&P mechanics, and a lead inspector spent 2 full days going through Sawyer's maintenance records and examining the aircraft. When they finished, their lead inspector sat down with Grant and Linnea in the conference room and delivered his assessment. "Whoever did this work is military grade," he said. "The documentation is the most thorough I have seen on a civilian airframe in 20 years. But we cannot sign off on another mechanic's work. That is his personal liability, his certification, and his signature. If you want our name on the release, we would need to strip the aircraft to bare metal and start the entire rebuild from scratch." He quoted $210,000 and a 12-week timeline. Grant's face went white. The Denver crew packed their tools and flew home the next morning. 3 days later, Grant convened a staff meeting. He sat at the head of the conference table, Linnea across from him, the 3 EMS pilots, Connie, a younger pilot named Deshawn, and a contract pilot named Harris along the side. Grant outlined his plan: engage a new maintenance firm, authorize a full reinspection, have the EC-135 back in service within 90 days. Connie had been sitting with his arms folded and his jaw set for the duration of the meeting. When Grant finished, the old pilot leaned forward in his chair and spoke. "I know who Sawyer Briggs is." The room went still. Connie spoke slowly, the way a man speaks when he has been carrying something heavy for months and has finally decided to set it down regardless of where it lands. "Chief Warrant Officer 4, United States Army, 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, the unit whose pilots flew the mission into the Abbottabad compound. Sawyer Briggs did not fly those helicopters, he maintained them. He test flew them. He was the man who signed the release that said they were safe to carry operators into missions this country will never publicly acknowledge. He is one of the most qualified helicopter maintenance technicians alive. And you refuse to pay him $47,000 for saving this hospital $250,000. Connie paused. The silence in the room was absolute. "I have been flying for 30 years, he said. "If that man does not sign the release, I will not fly. Not because I doubt the aircraft. I would trust that machine with my life because he built it. But I will not fly for an organization that treats a man like him the way you have treated him." Deshawn looked at Connie, then at Grant, then nodded. Harris did the same. 3 pilots. The entire EMS flight roster. The program was not just grounded, it was dead. Grant's face darkened. "That is insubordination," he said. "I will replace all 3 of you." Connie did not move. "You fire me. You lose 3 pilots simultaneously. The program shuts down completely. The board will want to know why, and I will make sure they do." Grant opened his mouth and closed it. The leverage had shifted, and everyone in the room could feel it. Linnea looked across the table at Connie. She understood now the full weight of what the old pilot had been holding Sawyer's identity, kept safe for months, while Connie watched in silence as the hospital cheated a man whose boots Connie was not fit to lace. And now he had spent his career, his pension, his professional safety, all of it laid on the table like chips. Because sometimes the only way to honor a quiet man is to be loud on his behalf. She excused herself from the meeting, walked through the hospital to the parking lot, sat in her car, closed the door, and cried. Not from sadness, not from relief, from the overwhelming, chest-cracking recognition that she had stumbled into something she had stopped believing existed: people who would sacrifice their own comfort to stand on the right side of a line that nobody had asked them to draw. The story moved through Granger Falls, the way stories move through towns of 18,000, not through headlines, but through overheard conversations at the diner counter, at the post office, in the school pickup line. The mechanic who lived in the trailer park on Ridgeline Drive rebuilt the hospital's rescue helicopter. The hospital refused to pay him. Now the helicopter sat on the pad collecting dust, and the pilots refused to fly even if it could. Opinions divided. At the VFW hall, veterans who understood what the 160th was called it a disgrace. At the hospital, Administrators who understood budgets called it a contract dispute. At the gas station, people who understood neither just called it a mess. A reporter from the Granger Falls Courier left a voicemail on Sawyer's phone. He called back that evening and declined the interview in a single sentence. "I do not want to turn this into a show," he said. "I just want to be paid for my work." The reporter quoted him anonymously in a piece that ran on page 3. It was the most widely read article the Courier had published in 2 years. Someone taped a copy to the hospital's front door overnight. Facilities took it down by 7 in the morning. Grant assembled his final play, a settlement offer, and $15,000, roughly 1/3 of the invoice contingent on Sawyer, signing both the return-to-service release and a non-disclosure agreement that would prevent him from discussing the terms of the settlement, the circumstances of the contract, or the hospital's role in any of it. Linnea was instructed to deliver the offer. She drove to the garage that afternoon, not because she supported the terms, but because her position required her to transmit them. She handed Sawyer the envelope and leaned against the workbench with her arms crossed, watching his face. Sawyer read the document standing up. He read it slowly and completely, the way a man reads something he intends to refuse, not for information but for the precise shape of the insult. He folded the paper once, set it on the workbench, and rested his hand on top of it. "Miss Garrick," he said, "I spent 14 years in the military where people die because someone torqued a bolt 2 pounds short. I have never cut a corner, and I am not going to sign a non-disclosure agreement to provide cover for a man who does." Linnea looked at him. The garage was cold and smelled of motor oil and old concrete, and the late afternoon light came through the bay door at an angle that lit the side of his face and left the rest in shadow. She did not see a mechanic. She saw a man whose integrity was structural load-bearing, built into the foundation, impossible to remove without bringing down the whole structure. And she understood, in the quiet and certain way that such things arrive, that she had been falling into this man's gravity for weeks, and that she had no interest in pulling free. 2 days later, Ruby brought a new drawing to the hangar. The hangar was padlocked, but she taped the picture to the door at her eye level. It showed the EC-135 flying against a bright blue sky, and across the bottom, in the careful, oversized handwriting of an 8-year-old, it read, "Daddy fixed it." Linnea found the drawing the next morning when she arrived for work. She stood in front of it for a full minute, breathing through her nose, pressing her lips together. Then she went to her office, closed the door, opened her laptop, and spent the next 3 hours building a case file. Every email, the complete project timeline, Sawyer's invoice, his maintenance records, all 412 pages, the Denver inspection team's written assessment, Grant's refusal letter, the EMS dispatch logs showing emergency calls that could not be answered. She packaged the entire file into a single submission and emailed it to every member of the hospital board of directors. She copied the hospital's general counsel. She did not copy Grant. She understood that this could end her career. She sent it anyway. The board convened an emergency session on a Tuesday evening. 12 members seated around the long walnut table in the hospital's 4th-floor conference room. Grant sat at one end, his jaw working silently. Linnea stood at the other with a laptop, a projector, and a folder thick enough to stop a door. She presented the case with the same methodical precision she brought to flight program logistics. The Billings contractor's original repair quote, $280,000. Sawyer Briggs's total invoice for the completed rebuild, $47,000. The Denver inspection team's written assessment of his workmanship, flawless, military grade, documentation exceeding anything they had seen in the civilian sector. The estimated cost of Grant's proposed alternative, a full reinspection and recertification by a new firm, $210,000 minimum. The EMS program dispatch logs, showing 2 emergency calls requiring helicopter transport that could not be fulfilled, including patient outcomes. She was halfway through the financial comparison when the dispatch radio in the adjacent room activated. The conference room's overhead speaker was patched into the EMS frequency standard procedure during any board meeting that involved the flight program. Everyone heard the call. A child, 9 years old, injured on a cattle ranch in the neighboring county, crushed trauma from an overturned piece of farm equipment, critical condition, requesting air transport to Street Marin. The room went silent. Every board member turned toward the speaker as the dispatcher's voice confirmed what they all already knew. The EC-135 was not cleared for flight. A ground ambulance had been dispatched from the nearest station. Estimated time to reach the patient: 43 minutes. Estimated transport back to Street Marin: another 51 minutes. Total time from injury to surgical suite: nearly 2 hours. Dr. Rebecca Adler, the senior trauma surgeon on the board, set her pen down on the table with a small, precise click. Grant attempted to partition the discussion. The flight program's operational status and this contract matter are two separate issues that should be addressed in separate. Dr. Adler stood up. "No," she said, and the single syllable cut the room in half. "This is exactly the issue. You saved this hospital $47,000, and the price tag is the safety of the people we are chartered to serve." She looked around the table. "I move to authorize full and immediate payment of the invoice." The vote was 11-1. Full payment. Immediate release of funds. A formal internal investigation into Grant Kelleher's handling of the flight program budget and his relationship with MedTransit West. Linnea stepped into the hallway, leaned against the wall, and called Sawyer. "The invoice has been approved," she said. "Full amount. Can you come sign the release?" There was silence on the other end of the line. Not hesitation, something closer to a man letting out a breath he had been holding for 6 weeks. Then his voice, quiet and steady. "I will be there in 20 minutes. Sawyer pulled into the hospital parking lot 17 minutes later. He walked across the tarmac to the hangar where Connie, Deshawn, Harris, Linnea, and a half-dozen flight nurses and paramedics were already waiting. No one spoke. The hangar lights were on, and the EC-135 sat in the center of the floor like something waiting to be released. Sawyer walked straight to it. He opened 3 inspection panels, checked the main rotor head, ran his hands along the tail boom, and knelt beside the skids to inspect the lower airframe, not because he doubted any of it, but because a man who had spent his career keeping people alive at altitude did not skip steps, even when the steps were ceremonial. He stood, opened the maintenance logbook to the final page, took a pen from his shirt pocket, and signed his name on the return-to-service release. Connie stepped forward. He took Sawyer's hand and held the grip for a beat longer than a handshake requires, the way one soldier grips another. "It is good to fly with you, Chief," he said. It was the first time anyone in Granger Falls had addressed Sawyer by his military title. Sawyer nodded. His eyes were bright, but he did not look away. 20 minutes later, the rotors spun up for a check flight. Connie lifted the EC-135 off the helipad, and the downwash swept across the tarmac in a deafening wave that smelled of kerosene and cold Montana air. Sawyer stood on the ground and watched the aircraft climb. The sound filled the valley. Linnea stood beside him, not close enough to touch, but close enough that the rotor wash moved between them like a shared breath, pressing their jackets flat, rearranging everything. Ruby came running from the hospital entrance. One of the flight nurses had been watching her inside. She threw her arms around Sawyer's leg and looked up. "Daddy, I see it. Your helicopter is flying." Sawyer reached down and lifted her onto his hip, and Ruby pointed at the sky with both hands, laughing into the wind. Linnea watched them, the tall, quiet man, and the small girl framed against the gray sky and the rising aircraft, and she smiled in a way that reached places she had stopped visiting years ago. Grant Kelleher was asked to resign 15 days later. The board's investigation confirmed the undisclosed financial interest in MedTransit West, and the matter was referred to the state attorney general. Grant's departure was not dramatic. There was no confrontation in the hallway, no public statement, no satisfaction. He left the building on a Friday afternoon with a banker's box and a face that suggested he had already begun constructing a version of events in which none of this was his fault. No one watched him go. There was nothing to see, just the quiet arithmetic of a man who had treated people as expenses, finally being subtracted from the ledger himself. 1 month later, Street Marin Regional Medical Center offered Sawyer Briggs a full-time contract as Chief Aviation Maintenance Technician. Salary, health insurance, dental, retirement, all of it. The terms reflected what the hospital had learned through the most expensive possible lesson, that competence is not a commodity, and the people who possess it in rare measure should never be treated as if they are disposable. Sawyer signed the contract on a Monday. He and Ruby moved out of the trailer park the following weekend, into a small two-bedroom house on Elm Street, 3 blocks from Ruby's school. It had a yard with a cottonwood tree, a front porch wide enough for 2 chairs, and a kitchen table that did not fold into the wall. Ruby taped the drawing to her bedroom wall that first night. The one that read Daddy fixed it. She smoothed the corners carefully and stepped back to look at it the way a curator examines a painting. Sawyer stood in her doorway, arms crossed over his chest, watching her settle into a room that was hers, not borrowed, not temporary, not a narrow space at the back of a trailer that shook when the wind blew. His face held the expression of a man who had become so accustomed to impermanence that stability felt like a foreign language, and who was now, for the first time in 3 years, allowing himself to learn it again. Linnea came to the hangar at the end of a Wednesday shift. Sawyer was wiping grease from his hands with a blue shop rag, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, the faded tattoo visible in the overhead fluorescent light. She set a cup of coffee on the workbench, the same gesture she had made dozens of times before, but this time she pulled up a stool, sat down, and stayed. They talked about the EC-135's upcoming 100-hour inspection, about Ruby's parent-teacher conference, about whether Montana winters were genuinely worse than Kentucky ones or just differently cold. They talked about nothing important and everything that mattered. The hangar was quiet except for the hum of the overhead lights and the occasional distant sound of a truck passing on the highway. They did not talk about what was happening between them. They did not need to. It was already there, patient, structural, built from months of shared silence and small gestures, and a trust that had been tested and had held. When Linnea stood to leave, Sawyer spoke. Linnea. It was the first time he had used her first name instead of Miss Garrick. She turned. He looked at her with the steady, unhurried gaze of a man who chose words the way he selected tools carefully, one at a time, matched precisely to the task. Thank you, he said, not for the contract. For believing the work mattered. Linnea looked at him. She nodded once, slowly, and then she smiled. Not the professional smile, not the composed one, but the kind that arrives without permission. The kind that a person does not plan or rehearse or control. The kind that changes the temperature of everything it touches. Sawyer stood on the helipad at dusk. The Montana sky was wide and copper-streaked and fading at the edges. The EC-135 sat in the lit hangar behind him, fueled and ready for the next call. Ruby was home safe, fed, asleep by now in a room that belonged to her, in a house that would still be there in the morning. Linnea had driven away an hour ago, but the coffee she had brought him was still warm in his hands. Somewhere beyond the mountains, in the valleys and along the switchback roads, the helicopter he had rebuilt from nothing was keeping people alive, and Sawyer Briggs, the man who had once ensured the safety of the most classified rotary-wing aircraft in American military history, had finally found his own ground to stand on. He had not been looking for recognition, and she had not been looking for someone to trust. But in a small hangar in Granger Falls, Montana, they had both found the thing they did not know they had been missing.